Previously on Distort the Preamp.
What are the key ingredients of a hit record? The kick, the snare, and the bass. You get those right, the foundations of your song are going to be okay.
And to my surprise, even in synth pop, performing the bass usually sounded better than programming it.
The bass on West End Girls is played.
But I was about to find out that yesterday's hitmakers had a few more bass tricks up their sleeves.
The first time I was involved with recording bass, it wasn't actually synth bass. It was bass guitar with my own band in the 1980s. And those early efforts to get it sounding right taught me lessons that apply to all types of bass, from electric bass guitar to synth bass, and in all types of music, from rock to synth pop. It also taught me the key ingredients you need to make signature bass sounds. But it all started with my efforts to copy the sound of one of the most famous bass guitarists in the world in the 1980s, Sting and the Police. Sting was the king of pop bass, and his sound was huge. As well as being an accomplished player who wrote fantastic parts, his bass sometimes sounded so great it carried the entire record. That's certainly what it did with Walking on the Moon, and lots of the other songs on this album. His bass sound is big and fat and sustains forever. Yet it's also ultra-defined so that you can hear every note, and it has a thump that hits you in the chest. And somehow it sounds great on everything from a powerful sound system to a cheap Bluetooth speaker from the other side of a cafe. Even then, his bass sounds great and you can still hear every note he's playing. Well, when I tried to record bass, it sounded okay, like bass, but it had loads of problems. It didn't sound big, it lacked definition, and it didn't thump. And it was difficult to hear the part under the band without turning it up too loud. So I decided to discover all the tricks that Sting has used to record his amazing bass parts. There were a lot of them, and they changed the way I thought about bass sound forever. But they also held the key to great sounding bass in the parallel world of electronic music and synth pop. Meanwhile, I was still trying to record bass guitar, so I decided to try a classic trick straight out of Bass Guitar Recording 101. The idea is simple. You record the bass amplifier, normally using a microphone, but you also take a feed directly from the electric bass guitar itself. This second clean signal combines with the more rocky amplifier sound to give you, hopefully, the best of both worlds. Exciting bass, but with more definition. Let me show you how. This is what a bass guitar sounds like when you record it directly. No amp, just a cable. Well, it's nice and clear, but it's a little weak. Now, this is what a bass guitar sounds like through a valve amplifier. Much more exciting, but it loses the definition and clarity. But you combine those two sounds together, and now hopefully you have the best of both worlds. This recording technique certainly enabled me to get really good pop bass that sounded much more professional and polished. But it still didn't sound like Sting's bass. It just didn't seem to have that combination of natural sustain, definition, and thump. Well, the next thing I tried was an interesting bass recording technique from the world of progressive rock. Those guys often had bass that was really heavy, but somehow cut through. And it turned out they were being recorded in a fascinating way. They were splitting the signal and running into a second amplifier, only one intended for guitars. Ever wondered what a bass guitar sounds like through a distorted guitar amp? It sounds like this. It's fierce and biting. It would never really work on its own. But when you now blend that in with the other two bass sounds, you get this. While that extra distorted layer helps with definition and cut, but it wasn't very pop. And again, it certainly wasn't what Sting was doing. So I listened more carefully to the bass parts on this Police album, in particular, Walking on the Moon, and suddenly I heard it. In the chorus, there's a faint guitar doubling the bass part an octave up. How had I not heard this before? In fact, the idea of guitar doubling bass is not new and dates back to the early days of rock and roll. You hear it on Elvis records, all over Motown records like My Girl by The Temptations. I just never imagined that the Police, who remember had come out of punk, would do anything so fiddly. Well, making records is a bit like making movies. You use as many studio tricks as you have to in order to achieve a magical effect. A moviegoer is probably oblivious that what they're watching was acted in front of a green screen, and a record listener doesn't know or care that what they're hearing isn't really simply just a bass guitar. The best record producers know what they want the bass to sound like, and frankly, they don't care what they have to do to achieve it. With early rock and roll, it might be a case of adding a guitar to make the bass part a little more audible on smaller speakers. With 80s pop, like say Michael Jackson's Thriller album, as many as 4 synthesizer basses were layered to create the right effect, and even then a further real bass guitar was added as well. All that matters is that the effect is magical and the audience is spellbound. And speaking of spellbound, this is a record called Spellbound by the gothic rock band Siouxsie and the Banshees. It's the last place I would expect to find detailed production trickery. But I thought I'd check it out, if for no other reason than it was produced by Nigel Gray, who also produced the first 3 Police albums. I'd spoken to Nigel before he died, and I knew some of his recording tricks. And I knew this record very well indeed. I'm also a guitarist and warm up with the opening riff, which is played over nothing but a simple bass line. So I've listened to this record hundreds of times since I bought it in 1981. I've studied it. But until a few weeks ago, there was something I'd missed. You can't hear it at first, but there's a guitar doubling the bass an octave up. You hear it particularly in the 5th bar of the intro when it actually separates slightly with a small timing error. That guitar gives the bass definition, sort of makes it glisten, as well as helping it to gel with the main guitar riff. So doubling bass with guitar an octave up was a great trick, but there were more. And the next one would especially apply to synth pop, and in particular, Pet Shop Boys. Sting was unusual for a pop bassist. In addition to his standard fretted and fretless electric bass guitars, he also played the classical double bass. Double bass sounds very different to normal electric bass. The strings are thicker and more than 6 inches longer. That means that notes sound deeper and richer and have more overtones. Not only that, but if you play it right, it can thump like a kick drum and the sound hits you right in the chest. And Sting knew how to play it right. And this is one of the ways that Sting would add that extra thump to some of his bass parts. He would overdub double bass. In fact, he did this so much, he had the sides cut off one of his favourite double basses, stuck in a pickup to make it easier to record, and called it Brian. Brian appears on a lot of Police records and is one of the magical ingredients that gave Sting his bass sound. Depending on the recording, Sting would layer and combine electric bass, fretless bass, double bass, standard electric guitar, even piano, to make sure his final bass part had those elements: sustain, definition, and thump. So I learned a lot about bass by listening to Sting and the Police. But how does any of that apply to Pet Shop Boys and synth pop? Well, you remember last time I said this, that I'm using to demonstrate this, sounds like this. Well, I have a confession to make. That bass sound was made up of multiple basses. 3, to be precise. One main bass, another to add more bite, and then a magic ingredient to add thump. Why? Because that's exactly what Pet Shop Boys did on West End Girls. Their iconic bass sound was a layer of 3 sounds, each of which was designed to deliver those same 3 elements. Sustain came from an analog synthesizer, the Roland Jupiter 6. Extra bite and definition came from the legendary Yamaha DX7. But where did they get that third ingredient? The one that thumps and hits you in the chest like a kick drum? They used a sample of a kick drum. That's right. The third element in the West End Girls bass sound is a kick sample that hits on every bass note. This was Pet Shop Boys' version of starting with a good bass sound with plenty of sustain, blending in another bass sound through a distorted guitar amp for extra definition, and then overdubbing a double bass for thump. But Pet Shop Boys got a 4th benefit that combining sounds gives: sound design. Because what you get is a unique sound that comes from multiple sound sources and becomes very hard to copy. So bass layering, if done correctly, is not only how you create a fantastic bass sound, it's how you create a signature sound. Okay, let me show you how to make endless, killer bass sounds. This technique is not only going to give you fantastic results every time, it's going to naturally produce sounds that are much more unusual and unique than just using a single instrument or definitely a preset. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to call up a bass sound where you can really hear the note without too many overtones. I'm going to use one of my analog synths. And the reason for choosing this is that I tend to prefer my primary bass layer to have analog oscillators that drift slightly. The precise tuning matters less with low frequencies, and because I'm going to be layering this, even if the tuning wanders a bit, it'll just sound like chorusing and make it sound a little bit thicker. Now, this synth, which is a copy of the famous Moog Model D, has 3 oscillators, but I'm only going to use 1 because otherwise it can probably get a bit too thick. But there are no rules, and you should experiment at home. But for now, let's turn on a single oscillator. Let's set that oscillator to 16 feet, which is almost the lowest octave. I'm going to set it to square wave, open up the sustain, the filters open, and there we have a sound. I chose a square wave rather than a saw. For no particular reason, but the square's got fewer overtones, bit less buzzy. On a different day, I could have gone a different way. Could have used a different synth. Now I'm going to close the filter, make it a little softer. Nice. I'll put some decay on the filter envelope. There we go. Very nice. Let me just add some resonance. Give it a bit of character. That's nice. Now this synth lets me play legato too, so as well as doing, I can also go. That can be very expressive. So we're almost there. I just want to make sure the glide is set right. So glide is how you go. But in low quantities, it'll be very nice, particularly under other bass layers that don't glide and don't have legato. So this sounds very good. It sounds actually very good, so good that in a different context, it could potentially carry the bass part of a song on its own. So what's missing? Well, this bass sound is lovely once it's started, but it does lack bite. The attack isn't quite fast enough for, doesn't quite work, and it definitely lacks a kind of that immediate thump. I'm going to first just deal with the bite and definition. There are a few sounds that I might sort of normally consider to do that. So, for example, slap bass. Impossible to play without laughing. But those things can work very well. I could also use maybe a piano, like piano under bass is really nice. I could even use a sort of something like that might be quite nice. But I think what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to use my trusty Yamaha TX81Z from the 80s and call up my favourite bass patch called Lately. And that sounds like this. Classic, very responsive, and also, so it's got plenty of bite, extremely well defined, and, especially if you hit it hard, really good definition. It's not as full and rich as an analog bass, so let's add in the analog bass, and you get this. Yeah, pretty good. Can you hear how the second layer adds extra bite and definition, but doesn't change the overall character of the bass sound? So that sounds pretty fantastic. It's a lot better already. And to be honest, we could leave it at that. It's already quite a unique sound, the combination of FM bass and also traditional analog bass. But I want to give it that extra sort of elusive thump. And this third layer is where you can really make things sound extra interesting and tailor them to your song. Because I'm not going to use a third traditional bass sound at all, just like Pet Shop Boys did with West End Girls. I'm going to use a sample of a kick drum. In fact, I'm going to use a sample of this kick drum. I've already got my sampler armed, so let's sample it in. Okay, done. That's what it sounds like, but I don't want to add exactly that same sample to every note. I want the sample's pitch to vary with the bass. Now, even though when I play it, you can't particularly hear a note, it still has what you call a fundamental frequency. So I'm going to start by looking on a frequency analyzer to see exactly what note this kick drum actually is. It's a D sharp 2. That's almost a couple of octaves below middle C on a piano. So now that we know that, I can tell the sampler to place that kick sample up and down the keyboard so it changes tune as I change the notes. So now, there you go. Notice that even though you couldn't hear the pitch of the kick when I played it, you can definitely hear it changing when I go up and down the keyboard. So now let's add this into our two bass layers and see what we get. Yeah, that's huge. I don't actually know if it's going to come across on YouTube quite how big that is. That's a window shaking bass sound. Basically, the FM bass is already huge. The analog bass just gives it all of the girth. And then that crazy kick sample just hits you in the guts. The kick sample might be a little bit loud, but it doesn't really matter because it sounds so good. That is going to completely slap in the track. Look, I just want to stress what we've done here, because the point is, it's not only a great sound, it is a great sound, but it's not just that it's a great sound. It's an original sound. It's not a preset. And if the planets align, it could even potentially be a signature sound with a bit of tweaking. This is the kind of thing that can take a track from just okay to legendary. This is a sort of a next level habit. Very, very common in 80s synth pop for the bass that you're hearing to be a combination of two basses. Very common. West End Girls, it was 3. This is the kind of thing I really encourage you to try at home. Don't think that I'm trying to recreate the West End Girls bass sound. That's not the point. Don't think I'm saying take an analog bass, take an FM bass, take a kick sample. I'm not saying that at all. Think of it as 3 layers that do different things. Take a bass sound with some sustain in it. That's why I sort of played that slightly naff fretless sound from the M1. Anything you like. Just don't worry if it doesn't have enough definition. You can get that with the second layer. Now pick something which has got a really good bite, definition, and if possible, try and make that velocity sensitive with maybe the first layer not being velocity sensitive. So now you can vary by how fast or hard you hit the keys, how much bite you're putting into the notes. So now you've introduced articulation. You already have a sound that hasn't really been heard before. Now you can add sort of the extra sort of salt and pepper, which is a kick sample, a metal sample. Go to your kitchen, band some pops and pans, or you could just have something else where all you're really giving it is extra thump, extra transient, if that's what the track needs. And you're going to get, I mean, that's some powerful stuff. So let's put it in a track. I'll perform the bass, and you'll see how all of these elements can fit in. What I'm going to do while I'm playing the track is you'll certainly hear that the kick sample really helps define the rhythm. You'll hear what notes going on, mainly from this, and you'll also see that at times I will be doing that kind of articulation where I'm exploiting the legato-ness. So let's do this. If you like this video and you want to hear more stories about how records used to be made and see those techniques applied to real music, please like and subscribe. But first, I want to talk briefly about Nigel Gray, who produced this album, Regatta de Blanc, for the Police. Nigel Gray produced their first 3 albums, which included Roxanne, Can't Stand Losing You, Message in a Bottle, Walking on the Moon, Do, and of course the number 1, Don't Stand So Close to Me. In my opinion, those 3 albums capture the Police at their most original and interesting sounding, even though Nigel Gray was working under extraordinary budget and time pressure. Nigel Gray also produced the 3 best albums by Siouxsie and the Banshees, which included the singles Christine, Happy House, and Spellbound. All 6 of those albums for the Police and the Banshees were done in just a few years between 1978 and 1982. Now, some of you may wonder, what exactly does a record producer do? Where does the band end and the producer begin? I like to think of a record producer as being a record manifester. They're hired by the band or the record company to literally produce, as in manifest, a record. Some are audio engineers focused on getting the best sound. Some help arrange the songs and generally kick the band into shape. Some take charge of mixing the records, others delegate. But however they do it, they should be judged by the quality of those records. In Nigel Gray's case, he is responsible for 6 treasured records in my collection, all of which I still listen to. Thank you for watching. See you next time. And now I think I'm going to put on Regatta de Blanc.